I started at Pembroke in 1961. We still had Sunday dress dinners, and I remember having to get, a hat and gloves for freshman week. But intellectually, it was Brown, as it always was. They were very focused on the notion of a coordinate college. By that time, all the classes, of course, were men and women alike, or at least whatever you wanted to take. There were no separate faculty and none of that. What was different about Pembroke in those days from what it's like for women at Brown now is that because it was a coordinate college, we had all of our own activities. I was a Student Government Association president and a longtime operative. There was a Pembroke Record, there was a newspaper. There were all these activities that were limited to women, but it was also the beginning of the period in which women were allowed to work, for example, at the Brown Daily Herald. My classmate, Mary Jean Matthews, now Green, was the first woman managing editor of the BDH. So we were beginning to see that transition, but in many respects, the Pembroke of the early 60s was like the Pembroke of the 50s. We hadn't invented yet the women's movement, the modern women's movement. I started out as a pre-medical student, and I was not a very good one, so I switched to American civilization. I spent most of my career as a food and drug lawyer, and so for me, although I wasn't especially good at it enough to be a doctor, I learned a lot about scientific principles as well as other kinds of principles that have stood me in good stead ever since. But mostly what I learned to do, I hope, was to read critically and think critically and pull things together. The first thing that resonates with me about Brown's history, and one of the first things in Brown's history, is the charter, which was signed in 1764. And the charter is, to this day, a remarkable document, especially when you realize that it was worked on and signed in 1764. It talks about the kind of education that they wanted to provide at Brown, a liberal education. It talks about the liberal arts and sciences, which is not so common in that era. There's a line in it that says that everyone shall have full and free access to this university. And whether they meant it entirely or whether they only meant non-Roman Catholic Christians isn't so clear. But as time has gone on, we've been able to give those words full life, make them mean for today what they meant then translated for today. And so the charter remains something of resonance for me, and I think for a lot of other people as well. There are specific provisions in it that say that you can't teach religion as such. You can teach about religion. But even though it was founded by Baptists, it's clear that the curriculum is not supposed to be denominational or religious. It says, go ahead, teach about religion so that people can learn about morals and ethics and customs and traditions, but don't teach religion. Saying that women fought their way into the university is absolutely correct. It didn't happen by chance. It happened because the women, particularly of Rhode Island, fought the battle for many, many years. Starting essentially after the Civil War, there was a lot of discussion about should Brown admit women, should Brown admit women. What really happened was that Sarah Doyle and the other women who were members of women's clubs in the late 1800s did everything they could think of. They sent petitions, they had students, women students apply to Brown so that they could be turned down and then complain about it. They held teas with President Robinson and then with President Andrews and his wife, Ella. They sent petitions to the corporation. They did everything they could think of, including enlisting the Providence Journal. And one of the arguments that they made was that women who were mostly the teachers in Rhode Island had to go out of state for their education. And that made no sense when there was a perfectly good college right close to home. And finally, when Elisha Benjamin Andrews became president of Brown, was very sympathetic. I think President Robinson had been sympathetic, but said in one of his letters, I'm just too old for this. I can't deal with this. So it was left to Elisha Benjamin Andrews to persuade the corporation and the faculty that this was okay. And the first women started in 1891. The first women to get degrees were in 1894. While they were at it, they also admitted women to the graduate school. And so some of the first PhDs came in that first 10, 15, 20 years as well. Women, like men, always got Brown degrees. There's no such thing as a women's college degree, no such thing as a Pembroke degree. It was always admission to Brown. And in the early days and up through the early 70s, late 60s, it was thought of as coordinate education. It wasn't co-education because there was this separate institution. And in one of the course bulletins, Brown itself said that the aim of coordinate education was to offer to all properly prepared women precisely the same examination, the same courses of study, under the same teachers, the same degrees, the same opportunities in every respect that the university offers to men, but to preserve the distinct social life of a separate college. The first classes were held in some little building on the east side, and it didn't even have electric lights, so they sometimes had to meet in President Andrews' office in the winter. But what the women of Rhode Island did, in addition to agitation, in addition to shooting the way into the corral for women, was to raise money. Even before women were admitted to Brown, they raised money for scholarships so that when it happened, it happened. It could happen. And then women asked the corporation to build them a building. The corporation said, no, we're not building any building for women. So they set about to raise money. Sarah Doyle and the Rhode Island Society for the Collegiate Education of Women raised the money for what was the first building, Pembroke Hall. Sarah Doyle was unquestionably a force of nature. She was born in Providence. She was a teacher. She was also a very active woman in all of these Rhode Island clubs, in church clubs, in college-educated women's clubs. People note that her brother was the mayor of Providence, and that's true, but it's not clear to me that he had anything to do with any of this. She was herself. She was a skilled PR operative, as we would call it in today's terms. Every technique imaginable to get this issue on the front burner and to get people to assent to it. They clearly went through the list of trustees and fellows, the members of the corporation, and figured out who knew which ones. And much like you do a grassroots campaign in politics today, they would figure out somebody. For example, they enlisted the poet, James Greenleaf Whittier, who was a Quaker, to send letters to the Quaker trustees. And he said admitting women was a matter of simple justice. And some of these letters quoted the charter and said, you know, if you're serious about this charter, you should admit women. The charter clearly contemplates that everybody who's qualified should get to go there. So she just thought of one scheme after another. Until Pembroke College was named Pembroke College, it had been called the Women's College in Brown University. The male students, many of the alumni, I think less so the faculty, but the male students and the alumni really didn't like the association of the word women with Brown. It violated their sense of the rightness of things, the proper order of things. And so in the 1920s, they agitated to either make it a separate place altogether or at least give it a different name. It was decided to rename it Pembroke College in Brown University. It was never a corporation, unlike Radcliffe at Harvard, which was a corporate entity. Pembroke College in Brown University never was. There were two colleges. There was Pembroke College and the college, in quotes, which was the men's college. But that's how Pembroke came to be. And they simply chose the name that the women they'd been called Pembrokers because of Pembroke Hall. And so it made sense to name that entity Pembroke College. Brown kept fiddling with the curriculum over all of its history. And the so-called new curriculum, the Maxwell Magaziner curriculum from the late 60s, the report on the curriculum begins by citing all of the previous curriculums, which were not exactly the same as everybody else's curriculum, similar in many respects, but not the same. And now, the constructive irreverence at Brown is reflected in what is, I guess they're now calling it the Brown curriculum, but it's still the new curriculum, and it's different from almost everywhere. It's not Columbia, it's not Harvard. It attracts students who, because they're willing to shape their own educations, must have at least some constructive irreverence in their DNAs, and then it comes together as a sort of a institutional constructive irreverence. At least I hope so. I hope that's what Brown will always be. A lot of the alumni, the women graduates, were concerned about the absorption of Pembroke, thinking that women's needs, particular needs, would not be attended to. It wasn't so much an academic issue as it was almost a social issue. Lots of other women, me included, thought that the time had come, that the reasons for having a coordinate college had dissipated over time. And in a way, both of us were right, because what happened after the merger was that women's issues were not very well attended to for a very long time. There were very few women faculty. There were no deans in place to, women deans, or not very many at least. And so a different kind of battle, which is familiar to modern women, but was different from the original battles, was how do you make women fit into the whole? And all at once be part of the whole and indistinguishable from anybody else in the whole, and yet still make sure that their issues and rights are attended to. And that battle, I think, continues today. The Lamphere case was a major event in the late 70s whose ramifications went on for many, many years after that. Louise Lamphere was an assistant professor of anthropology who was denied tenure in about 1974 by the anthropology department. She went to court. She brought a class action against Brown and the president and the provost, arguing that sexual discrimination was pervasive at Brown and that she was entitled to tenure. In the event, the lawsuit turned up enough evidence of discrimination that it overrode the concerns about faculty or academic prerogative, and Brown decided to settle the case. It resulted in a consent decree, which is about 35 pages long and imposes both general obligations, like not discriminating against women, and a series of very complex, detailed requirements, including requirements that when a position opens up, they have to search carefully. They can't just, the old boys network can't make a phone call. They have to do a serious search of both women and men, and the same for promotions, that they have to show, the department has to show that if the woman doesn't get tenure, that nobody who did was just as qualified as she was, in which case she should have gotten tenure. I think a lot of people, including at least one of the provosts who served during that period, are of the view that that Brown's quality improved overall dramatically by reason of those searches, because instead of having a new professor brought in because somebody called somebody whom they knew, and that was, instead of the old boys network, they were searching much more broadly for men and women. And the result was the exposure of the then current faculty to people of high quality, male and female, that they hadn't pulled into the system before. The Lamphere case both improved the faculty overall, and it certainly improved the numbers of women faculty, both tenured and non-tenured, during that period. And then when the decree was finally lifted, Brown put in place other procedures which were voluntary, but which were somewhat similar to those that have kept us in pretty good shape. The Committee on Slavery and Justice was an initiative of Ruth Simmons to deal, as best a university can deal, with some of the history of Brown that had been obscured, probably deliberately. Some of it's well known that the Brown family, some of the Brown family at least, were slavers, that Moses then repented of it, and we're glad for Moses, of course. Slaves had helped to build University Hall. As the Committee on Slavery and Justice said, the slaves are everywhere in sight, but they're invisible. And it was a very courageous thing for Ruth to do. She took all of her chips and put them on the table and said, we're going to do slavery and justice. And she had the support of many, 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 many people, both known and unknown to her, and the opposition of many others. People said, well, we're never going to be able to raise money. We can't deal with this. It's too that. We did it. My own view is that everybody at Brown should reread the report on slavery and justice about once a year, just to remind ourselves that it wasn't always like this, it was like that. And that was a very painful episode in American history, and Brown was not exempt from it. Need-blind admissions at Brown, which means students are admitted without regard for their financial capacity, is important in all sorts of ways. As Gregorian always said, you can't be sure you're admitting the best students unless you know that you're not imposing another test about whether they can pay. Need-blind admissions also has a huge effect in diversity terms, because it's a fact of life in modern America that some of the people who can't afford to pay, many of the people who can't afford to pay, are African American or other underrepresented minorities. But overall, the question is, are we really open to everybody who's intellectually qualified and who wants to be here, or are we not? Brown is not as rich as some of its competitors. We've had to stretch harder. But Ruth Simmons' laser-like focus on need-blind admissions was one of her very important contributions to Brown. It made us a different and therefore better place than we had been before.